Every time I get back into Stranger Things, my genre studies brain starts like pinging off the charts. So I just wanted to talk about that a little bit, kind of in the context of my process of understanding why the Steve and Eddie ship is so popular, but also just in general, it's one of the things that I think is so interesting about Stranger Things in general. So I was recently at a Keith Haring exhibit, which was fantastic. And they had one of those like info boards next to some of his work that was really talking about the way that he utilized semiotics in his work. So if you're unfamiliar with it, semiotics is kind of the name for the process by which signs acquire meaning, how meaning attaches itself to things, and then how those signs kind of gain meaning and how it changes over time. The display also talked about one of Herring's inspirations, who was William Burroughs, and his cut up literary technique. And I'm just going to read this quote that they use because I think it's just a really good way of talking about how symbols can function. So it said that Burroughs treated language like a deck of cards that would be shuffled and redealt ad infinitum, producing intriguing new results with each subsequent hand. And then it went on to say, by employing unexpected pictographic juxtapositions, Herring created work that resisted easy narrative categorization, empowering viewers to construct their own meaning. So connecting this back to Stranger Things, the visual lexicon and the language of symbols that it is employing is the 80s. And personally, I think that it is at its best when it evokes those familiar traits, aesthetics, character tropes, like all of these things, but then does something really unexpected with them. It plays an interesting hand of cards with them. And I think a lot of that sort of like upending expectation happens with Steve. I will never forget the shock that I felt when Steve came back at the end of season 1 after he left Nancy and Jonathan to deal with the Demogorgon. I was not expecting him to come back. I understood genre conventions. I kind of understood that he was leaving now. And so to have him come back, it didn't just feel like I was watching the character burst through the door. I felt like he ripped through the script to say, I'm going to be here actually. And I just felt this sort of genre buckle at that moment, to have the jerk boyfriend actually start to become this like brave hero that we kind of know him as now. And another moment that always makes me kind of laugh and delight is when both Dustin and Steve show up at the Wheelers' house, because you would never expect them to be the ones who end up joining together and becoming one of the like emotional relationships of the show. You never would have expected that from episode 1, but they make it work. They play out that hand in a super interesting way. And then similarly, having Robin and Steve become platonic best friends is not what we were expecting, and it is again one of the best defining moments of the show. And in part 2, I'll talk about why having those great aspects makes other aspects so frustrating. Okay, now let's talk about places where Stranger Things falls a little short when it comes to playing with genre tropes and aesthetics. So if we say that it is at its best when it takes the familiar tropes and genre characteristics and all of these aspects of 80s media that we are very familiar with, shuffles them as a deck of cards and plays them out in a really interesting way and lets the cards dictate where they will go. It is at its worst when it insists on sticking to a predetermined storyline or characterization that no longer makes sense given how the symbols have changed in their new contexts. And there's a lot of places over the course of all 4 seasons that we could kind of explore this, but specifically trying to focus on Steve and Eddie because that's what my brain is on right now. I think both of them really suffered from this during this season. My dad and I were talking about the show earlier today, actually, and he mentioned, without me prompting, he was like, did you feel like it was a little bit weird the way that they forced Eddie's, like, cowardice thing at the very end and had him kind of do that whole, I didn't run away this time? He was like, I didn't feel like that was where the narrative was going. And I super agreed, and I kept a lid on all this shit, but I had already been thinking about it, because the thing for me that felt like was a page left from an earlier draft before the cards had been dealt, before Joe Quinn had been cast, before they had played the character out in the setting with the other characters, before the character of Eddie had evolved in a way that was really interesting, but no longer meshed with that being his, like, point Z, if he started at A to point Z. And there were a lot of things with Steve that I felt that way as well, where it just felt like earlier drafts that no longer meshed with where the story was telling us it wanted to go. I keep coming back to this image in my head of, like, The show Stranger Things talking to its creators saying like, "No dad, that's your dream, not mine," about the like storylines and character decisions that happen in it because they feel like they are very old conceptions that the creators had of what the show was going to look like that ignore the way that it has naturally evolved. And I think it is that inherent frustration between what we feel like the show is trying to do and what the show is being made to do that produces the best fan work almost all the time. There's this great quote that comes sort of from Henry Jenkins' work, which is, "Fans produce fan work the way that oysters produce pearls," which is the idea that it takes a seed of irritant for something beautiful to form around. But it starts with that irritation and dissatisfaction and desire for something more. So in part 3, I will finally talk about why that makes Steve and Eddie's combination so compelling. Okay, now finally, we can get to what I meant to start this with, which is why Steve and Eddie are an interesting combination, semiotically speaking. I think they're both separately really good examples of characters that provide really fun symbols to play with and remix, and then naturally putting them then together provides even more opportunity for a kind of dynamic interplay to emerge. And while Steve gets a lot of that exploration actually in the show, which again I think is why he's such a popular character, Eddie had a lot of potential for it to happen, and I think that's a lot of why part 2 really bothered a lot of people. The obvious stuff, other stuff aside, but it was specifically the cutting off of the potential for more exploration of the new ways that these tropes could be played with. And I think the fact that Eddie is a really interesting semiotic character is really evident in the way that kind of different sides of TikTok, different sides of fandom in general, are latching on to different aspects of him to kind of amplify. And this is a simplification, but it's kind of like the Chrissy's Eddie is very different from the Steve's Eddie, like parts of the fandom. Or even like I've talked about, the different vampire genres that we think that he would fit into shows the way that he provides a lot of symbols that people can kind of pick and choose from to like what they take out of it. You know, some people really focus on the fact that he's wearing a black hanky in his back pocket. And some people really focus on the fact that he, you know, is very protective and nurturing towards Chrissy. And some people really focus on the fact that he's like a badass music guy and like this, that, and the other thing. Like there's so many different ways to kind of latch into the character and then amplify him. And I think that the Steve and Eddie interplay is particularly interesting because we know who both of them would be in traditional stereotypical 80s media, and then we know who they are, especially for Steve, and the potential that was there for Eddie in this sort of new shuffled cards setting, and the space that that creates to play in for both of them and their relationship together is very fascinating and very fun to kind of engage with. But yeah, I've just been thinking about this stuff because of how popular Eddie was in such different ways and also why this ship got so popular. So I will be curious to see how it develops in season 5. If they decide to kind of, you know, take up the obvious cash cow of bringing him back, or if they stick to their guns of, no, we said the story was going to go this way and it's going to go this way. I don't really know where it's going to fall, but I do know that whatever happens, the fandom will create something interesting out of it. So we shall see.